Councillor Ellie Tree and Reuben. Thank you so much for joining me today and having a chat.
No worries.
Really appreciate it. You're the youngest councillor in council by 20 years in age, you said. That's amazing. Can you tell me what inspired you to join council, and why don't you think younger people in general want to become councillors?
So I was a member of a youth committee where I used to live in Bega that sort of became an advisory committee for young people for council. So I've always felt a sort of a sense of civic responsibility and wanting to understand, you know, why things are the way they are and how young people can have a voice in the future of, you know, the spaces that we live in. I wanted to join because as a youth worker, I work with a lot of young people who don't really feel like they have a say in the future, and I wanted to pull up a chair at the table and see how we can make that happen. Sorry.
No, that's all right. So basically working with youth made you realise that youth needed a bigger voice.
Yeah.
So why don't you think, it's wonderful that you had that avenue, but why don't other young people want to be part of council? Have you had any insights into that?
So I think there's definitely starting to be a push for it. There's a lot of not-for-profit organisations. A big one in particular is called Run For It, which is where they're sort of campaigning to get younger people to put their hands up to run in council. I think there's a lot of challenges. Lots of young people don't really understand the purpose or the role of a councillor. Also, it requires a significant amount of time and effort into researching and understanding, you know, what the limits of council is, what the requirements are for the role. And also, you know, I'm not sitting here because I get paid a large sum of money, so you've got to be really passionate about it. And I think there's definitely challenges for young people. Yeah.
So it's like the complexity, the formalities, the bureaucracy. It's kind of this miscommunication of what the role is and not much pay. That's interesting. Being the youngest councillor, what have you discovered being in council? Has there been anything in council life that surprised you?
Yes, actually. Funny you ask. I was just talking about this with the local member of parliament, how different state and federal politics are to local government, and how people just assume that this is exactly the same. Council meetings aren't like question time, and I think at the last local government elections, there was lots of people who were running, who were members of a party, who were making promises like, oh, we're going to be, you know, putting a bunch of money into this housing initiative if you elect us. And that confused me because as far as I understood, that wasn't the role of a councillor, and I'm right, it's not. So that process in itself of the election sort of chaos, I think might confuse the public a little bit as to what the role of a councillor actually is, because basically it's strictly governance, and everything that happens in council is governed by what the community wants, which is through the surveys and, you know, all of the community vision document. It's not necessarily who's sitting at the table.
So there's an overlay, you're saying, like people are looking at what's happening in federal and then they see a council meeting and they kind of draw a similarity, and people will come to council meetings and just rock up, bombard or question or something like this.
Yeah, I think it's also that a lot of bigger issues get pulled into council meetings, which takes away from local government being about the community and more about, you know, the bigger issues, which we are absolutely working towards tackling, like, you know, climate change and things like that. Last week at the council meeting, we got a report from our sustainability officer who identified that we are now on target to reducing our emissions by 45% by 2030, which is incredible. But that's not because we have two Greens councillors, or it's not because I'm there advocating for it. It's because that was a community vision that became a council target that we've all worked collectively as a community towards reducing.
That's really interesting. So instead of some people going, we need to focus on climate change, it's like, well, let's ground this down into Bellingen, Shire, and what we can do with our simple steps.
Totally.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. So recently there was a draft submitted by Council for the Economic Development and Tourism Plan, and what I noticed being a part of Bellingen community is that quite a few people weren't even aware there was a draft or that they could have a say. So what do you think about that, and how can we make a change?
So I think Council's really looking at changing the way that it communicates with community, and that's been one of the biggest focuses for, over the past year in particular. And now that Council has quite a large following on social media, we're hoping to really push the amount of people that engage with Council. I think lots of people probably don't really feel that when they have a say, it actually makes an impact. But the draft of the Economic Development and Tourism Plan was a really good example of how, when the community have their say through the correct processes, which is by submitting a response to a plan, how it gets incorporated and changes the plan to really set the focus on exactly what the community identifies that they want, to happen in the community.
Interesting. Yeah, because as you said, people don't understand the importance. There can be entire economic documentations going through and not even a whisper coming through, which is it's quite sad. So do you think it's a systems issue? What about if there was some sort of direct democracy where it was coming straight into the emails of people? And, because people are lazy. They don't want to go onto Council's website. Maybe there's a way of thinking, people sign up and then directly it goes into inboxes where you can vote on issues or be aware of issues or know when Council agendas are on. Is this something that Council's thinking on in terms of future? You said you were doing something in 2020. What was that?
So in 2020, I was a part of a deliberative panel, which was funded by Council to get a bunch of community groups and organisations to come together to look at what strengthening resilience in the community looked like. And the largest theme of all of the issues was communication, was the biggest one that was raised. So since then, Council has created a communication document that identifies different arms of Council and what the work is that they're doing and what level of communication or consultation is required. And so definitely since Council has increased its capacity through social media and communication staff members, I believe it has dramatically increased the amount of people who consult or who have a say on documents. But I definitely think there's room for improvement with streamlining so that the community gets something that snatches their attention so that they don't have to go looking for things that they can have a say on. Yeah.
Because, for example, I had a say and I wrote an email back and there wasn't a response for quite some time. And when I got the response, I feel like there was no answers. So how can that be better handled as well? Let's say it's streamlined the communication from community to Council. What about the responses? Do you think there's something in the responses that can be looked into as well?
Yeah, so my understanding of the way that it works is that every communication that comes through Council goes through one channel and then it's ticketed and then sort of directed to the right person for a response. There's probably a better way to do it, but at the moment, I think all of these people have quite a significant chunk of work, and their capacity to sit and respond to community probably isn't as large as we would like it to be as community members. And there's not sort of a reply and receive direct response thing. So I think it's about a 2-week time frame that you should hear back from, and if you don't, then absolutely follow up with a counsellor who can also follow up on your behalf. Absolutely. For a response.
Absolutely, because with these drafts like this, you're having people not submitting things, and then there's, response confusion, and then the reflection is not correct. So with this last draft, there was a really coherent team that had mobilised around housing that you'd said, but there's so many other issues as well. There's the river health and managing tourism flow, but these things kind of get lost, and so you get these other things coming to the forefront, which then Council has to listen to because that's the submission. And I find that quite interesting. But what I do love about Bellingen Council is I feel it's in a very unique position for its size. It manages 20,000 people or so in the Shire, as opposed to somewhere down south where I came from, which managed 400,000 people, and you could never get in touch with anyone. And I love that you guys are approachable, especially someone like yourself. You're on socials, you're sharing everything. I can chat to you, we're here doing this. That's really wonderful. So there's a great advantage of low-key intimacy. What do you feel out of this connection and this potential and this low size of population? What do you see the attributes that are going to take us into the future with that small size?
Yeah, I think it's definitely got its positives. It's really easy to reach out to community, and I guess that's why I have such a large presence and spend a lot of my time on social media, is because I know that even if, you know, there's people that aren't on social media, they know someone who is. And I think sharing as much as possible the processes of council, having such a small community, it's quite likely that there will be lots of people. So the more we can encourage people to engage with council's processes, the more we're going to get, you know, a bigger, diverse representation of views and thoughts on documents like the Economic Development and Tourism Plan. And it's easier to do that living in a small council area. But absolutely there's challenges as well. You know, 57% of our Shire is state forest and national parks, which is unrateable, which means that we have far less money to spend on things that other councils that have a larger size do.
So there's so much potential, but there's just a few miscommunication issues. But it's just about making council cool again and just bringing it to the forefront. You know, for example, there was these options for Sewering Maelstrom. That was a very contentious thing that happened recently, and option 3 was chosen, and I saw that because of your post. Can you elaborate a little bit on that and what was chosen and what happened? Because I'm sure there's lots of people who have got no idea.
So the Sewering Coastal Villages project went back quite some time, I think before I was even born. It became something that was identified as a concern for river health and for the oysters and you know, people's health as well. And so, but before my time in council, there was a grant that was secured through the state government to sewer the coastal villages, and that was Repton, Raleigh, Maelstrom and the industrial estate. And so basically what happened is the tender was done by Public Works New South Wales, so they costed it all and then passed on the tender to council. We went out for tender. And then the prices that came back were significantly higher than what Public Works had identified, and that was due to, off the back of COVID, there was a lack of contractors, so competition was quite large. Increases in cost of materials and things like that really increased for everyone, not just for council. And so this particular project, the scope increased by, I think, 80% in cost. And so for council, with the new incoming federal government, it was about sort of pulling it apart into bite-sized chunks and working out how we can proceed in a process that is going to ensure the original intention of the grant, which is that we increase the capacity of places that are able to be sewered, ensuring the river health, ensuring people's health, and also ensuring that Raleigh Industrial Estate can expand so that we have more commercial industry in the Shire. So option 2 was to sewer Raleigh Industrial Estate. Option 3 was to start with Maelstrom. And I voted to do that, even though we are, securing a significant amount of funds to commence with Maelstrom first. We need to remember that that'll be paid back out of the sewer account, because that's what it's paying for. So if we connect 203 residents, their funding to be connected will pay back the money that we have to borrow to connect them, which will be a larger rate base than it would be if we just connected the industrial estate and 26 lots. And at the end of the day, we need to upgrade the Urunga sewage treatment plant, and then we could sewer Maelstrom, and then there could be a grant that becomes available, and then it could all progress as smoothly as if it never happened in the first place and it was all normally connected. So we'll see what happens.
Wonderful. Thanks for explaining that. And I think it's a perfect example when contentious things like this do come up, but then you have people that don't engage and then they just complain. So can you briefly explain how to engage with council, not with the submissions, but at a council meeting? You said before, please explain. What was it?
So if you are looking at the agenda for a council meeting and there is an issue coming up that you would like to speak on, there is a form that you can submit on Council's website, and it's called putting in a deputation, which is basically coming to speak. You get 5 minutes. You can request your time to be extended if your 5 minutes runs out, and you still have more that you want to say. And basically that's it. You have 24 hours before a council meeting. You can still request to speak, and they will move the item that you want to speak to forward so that you're not sitting through a 5.5 council meeting waiting to have your say.
Wow, that's good to know. And maybe just elaborate a little bit on, because some people are really impatient and they think, why do things take so long, but you gave an example. There was some sort of construction happening somewhere and it took 10 years for it to get through. Why do things take a long time? Is it because of the bureaucracy and a lot of people having to okay it, or
Yeah, I think it's process, and I think the best example I can give is the Yamba skate park. And that did take 10 years. There was a young boy who started a petition 10 years ago, and he cut the ribbon to the opening, which is pretty awesome. But I think when you look at democracy, basically what you're doing when you're fighting to change something is changing it for the next generation, not for yourself. That's the way I look at it. And so I guess the way that people should view council is by each council term, because every new term of councillors, we refresh all the documents. And so we pull out the community strategic vision, we redo the survey, and the more people that engage, the more of an understanding we have of what the community wants. And then every single thing council puts in its operational yearly plan comes directly from that document that the community's gone, this is what we want. And that's how council justifies its operations. And so then that will be done every year based on that document, basically. And so the more the community engages, the more that the actions are going to reflect that. But that still takes a year. And then if you've got, we've had 3 floods, and I think in 2 of them ours was declared a national emergency, and therefore, we had to park all of our operational plans. So all of our capital works programs, the footpaths that were supposed to be built, the shade sails that were supposed to go up at the skate park, the curbside planting, there's all these different things that are supposed to happen, but we had to stop works on all of that just to get back to square one to where we were, which was fixing the roads, removing the landslip on the mountain, and so then all of those works get pushed over into the next year's operational plan. And so lots of people, would look at it and go, it's a cop-out, but really we don't have a workforce that is sizable enough to deal with getting back to where we were from a natural disaster while also creating all of these new things at the same time.
Yeah, and if people engage, then they'll actually know what you guys are dealing with, the amount of funding and the budgets and all that. Very interesting. So to get a little bit personal here, what's the hardest part of being a councillor just for yourself? What have you experienced?
Oh, that's a good question.
Yeah, I'm sure there's challenges. Especially being a new mum.
Yeah, so probably the amount of time it takes, and the community's misunderstanding of the role of council and the role of councillors in particular. So I get asked a lot of questions, and I love receiving questions and I love finding out the answers, but I don't know all the answers off the top of my head, and I'm not involved in the operational work. So usually if someone asks me a question, what I do is submit a request with their question, which is what they can do anyway. So coming to a councillor adds another step. So I think the biggest challenge for me is probably learning not to ask all the questions on behalf of people, but rather spend my time empowering them to ask their own questions and showing them the processes so that they always have that ability to go and do that regardless of whether I'm around.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So you're so passionate about helping people, but then you...
Yes, overhelp.
I understand that. Is there anything you've had trouble keeping up with, just in general?
Yes, probably getting to people's events. So there's a large expectation that we will attend lots of community events. I haven't been to very many at all, obviously being a new mum, and I've also got, a 4-year-old and an 8-year-old and a husband who runs a business and work outside of council. So as much as I really would love to be at every opening and every attending event, that's probably my biggest challenge, is being able to be everywhere at once.
Yeah. Wow, I understand. Just to finish up, I'd love to hear about the Verge project. Is that what it was called that you put the motion on? Because we talked about it off camera, but I'd love to hear what you did and that it's been accepted and just a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I put in a notice of motion for council to write a policy and a document on Verge gardens within the Shire. And basically what that came from was I put out a notification on Facebook to let the community know that Essential Energy were chopping a tree down in North Bello. And the community blew up, and so I thought this just seems ludicrous that there's no guidelines to helping us understand where we can plant trees, what appropriate trees are to plant, what future construction plans might get in the road of us planting gardens on our verges. And I had quite a few messages from people as well who identified that not having guidelines made it quite challenging for them to know what they can plant, you know, before council will come over and go, actually, you can't do that there. So I put in a notice of motion and it was voted, all councillors voted for it, and the Deputy General Manager of Operations determined that it would be in the next year's operational plan and put into the budget to be implemented next year, which is awesome.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah. And like you said, you know, being mindful of what's getting planted so it doesn't obstruct walkways, and there's so many elements to it, which is
yes.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
One last thing I want to know. Recently there was a really momentous council meeting and the motion got passed to stop native logging in the area, and I understand that doesn't mean that it's happened straight away. Can you give us a little update of where that is and what's happening?
So the notice of motion that was put forward was to write to the members, the relevant members and their, you know, whoever holds the portfolios, I can't remember exactly who it was, to write to them to let them know that our position on native forest logging was that we would like them to stop. It is state forests and we can't go in and stop them from logging. That's, you know, a state policy, but that was basically what was passed, was that we would write a letter to the members of parliament to let them know that that's our position.
Yeah. But that's still huge.
Yeah. And we'll see, you know, there's a state election coming up, so it'll be interesting to see what different candidates' policies are put, you know, or what they're going to put forward.
Exactly. And the more that little councils step up, and then there's a knock-on effect. It's
absolutely.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Ellie Tree.
Thank you.
I really appreciate it. It's lovely meeting your son, and I just love
Thanks.
what you're doing. Thank you.